Constellation. Belytanus. Referred to as the Maiden in common parlance, depictions of the constellation Belytanus vary from one age to the next. It has always been considered fashionable for prominent women of the day to be declared the Maiden's personification. Queen Madrigal in the Exalted Age, for instance, and Queen Asha before her. None of these women would likely appreciate the fact that Belytanus is believed to have originally referred to Urthemiel, the old god of beauty. From a study of Theodosian astronomy by Sister Orin Pedartrius. Draconis. Called High Dragon in common parlance, the constellation Draconis is always depicted by a dragon in flight. Recently, it has come into question whether this was the case in the ancient Imperium. Most Tevinter dragon imagery was reserved for the old gods, so why would they dedicate a constellation to dragons in general when specific dragons were held in such reverence? The speculation is fueled by older drawings showing Draconis as more serpentine in appearance, perhaps depicting a sea creature or an unknown eighth old god that was stricken from historical record. From a study of Theodosian astronomy by Sister Orin Pedartrius. Alluvia. Owing primarily to the popular Orlesian tale of the same name, the constellation Alluvia is commonly referred to as sacrifice. During the Glory Age, folklore told of a young woman saved from a lustful mage by being sent into the sky by her father, after which the mage killed him, hence the sacrifice. The daughter became the constellation, depicted as a seated woman with her head in the clouds. Prior to this tale, Alluvia was thought to represent Raziel, the Tevinter old god of mystery, and the constellation was the source of many superstitions involving the granting of wishes. From a study of Theodosian astronomy by Sister Orin Pedartrius. Equinor. Referred to as the stallion in common parlance, the constellation Equinor has historically been depicted either as a rearing horse or a seated griffin. Some scholars speculate that the constellation's original image was that of a hala, which could indicate a deliberate supplantation of the constellation's original representation as Gillidan, the elven goddess also known as Mother of the Hala. However, as horses had its great significance in early Neuromedian culture, from which the ancient Imperium descended, the speculation is largely considered unfounded. From a study in Theodosian astronomy by Sister Orin Pedartrius. Fenrir. Called White Wolf in common parlance, Fenrir has always been considered an oddity among scholars, primarily because wolves have no special place within ancient Tevinter folklore. To many, this represents the strongest argument that the Imperium deliberately supplanted older elven constellation names. In the case of Fenrir, in alignment with the elven trickster god Fen'Harel would be logical. Others claim a much older Neuromedian tale of a wolf escaping hunters by fleeing into the sky exists, but the legend's veracity has never been proven. A study of Theodosian astronomy by Sister Orin Pedartrius. Fervenial. Commonly referred to as the Oak, the constellation Fervanus is generally represented by a towering tree with leafless branches. Many scholars believe this is representation of nature that harkens back to the lore of the early Neuromedians, whose belief largely aligned with animism prior to the rise of old god worship and the creation of the Tevinter Imperium. Others, however, believe that Fervanus was originally a constellation of the elven people, specifically a depiction of Andruil, goddess of the hunt. Virtenedal, or Way of Three Trees, is a central tenet of Andruil and something that Fervanus originally represented this concept. From a study of Theodosian astronomy by Sister Orin Pedartrius. Judex. Depicted as a downturned sword, the constellation Judex is oft called the Sword of Mercy in common parlance. Even though the sword image was assigned to the stars long before Andraste's time, Judex referred to the concept of justice in ancient Tevinter, and the downturned aspect of the sword indicated a guilty verdict, which in those times generally translated to execution. Obviously, with its modern meaning and use as a symbol for the Templar Order, the old interpretation is frowned upon in scholarly circles. From a study of Theodosian astronomy by Sister Orin Pedartrius. Chios. Referred to as Chaos in common parlance, the constellation Chios is thought to represent the old god Zazicael. These stars have often been depicted as ill omens, thus in the Tower's Age, a movement within the chantry sought to change the constellation to a representation of a dove. It did not gain traction. According to folklore, the priest behind the effort fell from a bridge and died shortly after Divine Joyce II made the decision against her. I maintain that this never actually happened and is nothing more than astrological superstition. From a study of Theodosian astronomy by Sister Orin Pedartrius. Paraquialis. Referred to as Voyager in common parlance, the constellation Paraquialis is commonly depicted as a ship. no ordinary ship, but rather the primitive vessels sailed by ancient peoples such as the Neomenians. The translation from ancient to Vene is usually across the sea, and leads credence to the idea that Neomenians came to Thetis from elsewhere, although most reputable scholars dispute this, especially considering those ancient peoples would likely to have named these stars long before they undertook such a voyage. From a study of Theodosian astronomy by Sister Oren Padartrius. Saturnalis. Referred to as either Satina, after the moon, or as Saturnalia, after the holiday, in common parlance. The constellation Saturnalis has always been depicted by the celebrant, a seated man playing a lyre. It should be noted that in ancient Tevinter, the constellation was known as Mortimalis, and was represented by a warrior holding aloft a head, usually that of an elf. The movement to officially rename it took hold in the Divine Age, and after 800 years, the original is all but forgotten. From a study of Theodosian astronomy by Sister Oren Padartrius. Servani. Referred to as the chained man in common parlance, the constellation Servani is traditionally represented by a man dragging a heavy chain behind him. This is thought to be an ancient Tevinter representation of both Andorral, the old god of slaves, and of the Tevinter system of slavery itself. The representation of Servani had been used by the Trislis Guild for well over 2,000 years, according to their claim, and is visibly imprinted upon the armor of both juggernauts, the giant golems guarding the gates of the city of Minrathous. From a study of Theodosian astronomy by Sister Oren Padartrius. Silentir. Referred to as Silence in the common parlance, the constellation Silentir is historically attributed to Demot, the old god of silence and the leader of the ancient Tevinter pantheon. The depiction of the constellation, however, is often debated. Some depict a dragon in flight, while others, also the most common modern depictions, show a man carrying a horn and a wand. Some scholars believe these represented scales, which would point to the constellation being a supplantation of the elven mythal, but nothing indicates this to be more than speculation. From a study of Theodosian astronomy by Sister Oren Padartrius. Solium. There are two common interpretations regarding the history behind the constellation Solium, commonly referred to as the Sun. The first is that it represents the fascination of early peoples, such as the Neomenians, predecessors to ancient Tevinter Imperium, with all objects in the sky, the sun and moon in particular. Indeed, many believe proper depictions of Solium is as both. The second interpretation is that this constellation originally represented Elgrinon, the head of the elven pantheon, who was also known as Eldest of the Sun. Modern scholars do not know which, if either, is true. From a study of Theodosian astronomy by Sister Oren Padartrius. Tenebrium. Called Shadow in the common parlance, likely due to the ancient association for this constellation Tenebrium with Lusicon, the old god of darkness and the night. It is odd, however, that the depiction for this constellation has always been an owl and not a dragon, even in the Tevinter texts. This lends credence to the widely held belief that Tenebrium was a name meant to supplant an older elven association, perhaps with the elven god Falun Din, sometimes represented in tales as a giant owl. There is, of course, another explanation. Owls are nocturnal hunters, and among earlier people were considered terrifying omens of loss. From a study of Theodosian astronomy by Sister Oren Padartrius. Thoth. The only constellation to maintain its ancient name in the present day, the constellation Thoth directly corresponds to the ancient Tevinter old god known as Thoth, the dragon of fire. The depiction for this constellation varies, usually represented either as a man of flame, in agony, presumably the victim of an old god, or as a flaming orb. Scholars in the Divine Age attempted to officially change the nomenclature to Ignifir, which is why some old texts record it as such, but the attempt never caught on, even after the eradication of old god worship in the Imperium. From a study of Theodosian astronomy by Sister Oren Padartrius. Belenos. According to Avar legend, Korth the Mountain Father kept his throne at the peak of the mountain Belenos, which lay at the center of the world and was so lofty that from it he could see all the corners of the earth and sky. Over time, bold young Avar would challenge each other to scale the mountain of the gods. At first, Korth found this amusing, and he delighted in the valor of their failed attempts to enter his hold. Then Sindri Skybreaker, boldest of the heroes of old, succeeded in climbing to the summit and stood in the hall of the Mountain Father in the flesh. Korth, being a good sport, gave Sindri a hero's welcome, and the mortal returned to the Frostbacks with tales of gods and gifts from Korth, and soon more and more heroes were barging into the hall of the Mountain Father, demanding to be showered with honors. Korth grew weary of throwing banquets, and the other gods began to fear his temper. So Korth spoke to the Lady of the Skies and lifted Belenos from the earth into her realm, which could not be reached even by the most intrepid climber, and there he dwells in peace. From a study of Theodosian astronomy by Sister Oren Padartrius. Fulmenos. Commonly known as the Thunderbolt, the constellation Fomenos depicts a bolt of lightning thrown by a wrathful god. Which god has always been a matter of dispute. Each of the old gods of Tevinter have been credited as the thrower, with the target being anything from the lost city of Barendur to a jester who made a particularly heinous pun. From a study of Theodosian astronomy by Sister Oren Patartrius. Visus. Known as the Watchful Eye in common parlance, this constellation had great significance to the ancient Alamari and Syrian people of southern Thetis. The story goes that the Lady of the Skies opened one eye so that the light from her gaze could lead her people safely from the frostbacks. When Andraste's armies marched north from their ancestral lands to wage war upon Tevinter, they were guided by the eye, and it became the Maker's gaze, not the Lady's, leading them to victory. The sword was added later. It is said that the star that marks the point of its blade only appeared in the night sky after Andraste's death. The early Inquisition took Visus as the symbol of their holy calling when they joined the Andrastian faith, the eye representing both their search for Maleficarium and the Maker's judgment upon their actions. When the Inquisition ended and became the Seekers of Truth and the Templar Order, the Templars took the sword while the Seekers retained the eye. From a study of Theodosian astronomy by Sister Oren Patartrius.